The night was unusually calm. No moonlight reflected off the water. No warning came over the radio. Only the slow rhythm of engines cutting through the blackness of the Java Sea. For the men aboard USS Houston and HMAS Perth, this silence felt wrong. We want to know, where in the world are you watching from? Comment below and subscribe. They were not supposed to be here. Not like this. Not alone. By early March 1942, the Pacific War had already turned against the Allies. Singapore had fallen. The Philippines were collapsing. The Dutch East Indies were burning. Everywhere, Japanese forces advanced faster than anyone had believed possible. And now, to weary cruisers damaged, low on ammunition, and cut off from support were slipping through the narrow waters of the Sunda Strait, hoping to escape. They believed the passage was clear. It was not. Unseen in the darkness ahead lay a massive Japanese invasion force transports packed with troops, escorted by cruisers and destroyers, their torpedo tubes loaded, their guns already trained toward the sea lanes, 20 ships. Against 2. On the decks of Houston, sailors stood at their stations, unaware that they were sailing directly into one of the most uneven naval battles of the entire war. The cruiser still bore scars from earlier fights, her rear turret destroyed, her hull patched just enough to keep her afloat, yet her crew had not lost their resolve. On Perth, Australian sailors watched the horizon, sensing danger, but unable to name it. They had fought before. They knew what Japanese night tactics could do. And still, they pressed on, because there was no alternative. Behind them lay occupied ports and enemy airfields. Ahead lay uncertainty and hope. Then, without warning, the darkness exploded. Searchlights slashed across the water. Gun flashes tore holes in the night. Torpedoes cut invisible paths toward steel holes, moving far too slowly to escape. In seconds, the illusion of safety vanished. This was not a skirmish. This was not an ambush. This was an execution interrupted only by the stubborn refusal of 2 ships to die quietly. What followed would be a battle fought at point-blank range, in total confusion, where bravery clashed against overwhelming force, and survival depended as much on chance as on skill. By dawn, both cruisers would be gone, but their story of sacrifice, defiance, and the stand made against impossible odds would echo long after the last shots faded into the Java Sea. To understand why Houston and Perth found themselves alone in the Sunda Strait, one must look at how rapidly the Allied position in Southeast Asia collapsed. In late 1941, the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, were one of the most valuable prizes in the Pacific. Beneath its jungles and shallow seas lay vast oil reserves, resources Japan desperately needed to sustain its war effort. Without them, the Imperial Navy and Air Force would eventually grind to a halt. Japan knew this, and they moved with terrifying speed. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces struck south in a carefully coordinated campaign. Within weeks, Hong Kong fell, then Malaya, then Singapore, the so-called Gibraltar of the East. Each defeat sent shockwaves through Allied command structures already stretched thin and struggling to cooperate. The defense of the region fell to a hastily assembled multinational force known as ABDA. Command American, British, Dutch, and Australian naval units thrown together under immense pressure. On paper, it looked formidable. In reality, it was fractured. The ships spoke different signal languages. They followed different doctrines. They had never trained together. Worse still, they were facing an enemy who had mastered night combat, torpedo warfare, and rapid amphibious assaults. By February 1942, Japanese landings were happening faster than Allied ships could respond. Air superiority was already lost. Allied cruisers and destroyers were forced to operate under constant threat from bombers they could barely see coming. The decisive blow came during the Battle of the Java Sea. In a brutal engagement, much of the Allied striking force was shattered. Ships were sunk, scattered, or forced to withdraw. command cohesion evaporated almost overnight. What remained were isolated vessels, damaged survivors searching for a fuel, ammunition, or simply a way out. USS Houston and HMAS Perth were among them. Both cruisers had survived earlier battles, but survival came at a cost. Their crews were exhausted. Their magazines were depleted. Repairs had been rushed and incomplete. Yet orders were clear: escape Java, if possible, and regroup elsewhere. The Sunda Strait seemed like the only option. Allied intelligence believed the passage to be relatively safe. Japanese invasion convoys were expected to approach from different routes. No one anticipated a major landing force moving through the strait that very night. That assumption would prove fatal. While Houston and Perth prepared to slip through under cover of darkness, the Japanese were executing one of the largest amphibious operations of the campaign. Thousands of troops bound for Java's western coast, protected by a powerful naval screen. To movements, same waters, same night. This was not a failure of courage. It was a failure of time, coordination, and intelligence, the inevitable result of a defense collapsing faster than it could be repaired. By the time the two cruisers entered the strait, the strategic situation had already sealed their fate. They were no longer part of a fighting fleet. They were the last echoes of a defense that no longer existed. Among the battered remnants of the Allied fleet in the Dutch East Indies, USS Houston stood out not because she was unscathed, but because she was still fighting. Commissioned in 1930, Houston was a Northampton-class heavy cruiser, built for speed, long range, and heavy gunfire. Her 9 8-inch guns had once made her a formidable surface combatant. By early 1942, only 6 of them remained operational. The ship's damage told a story of survival under constant pressure. Just weeks earlier, during the air attacks in the Makassar Strait, Japanese bombers had found their mark. A direct hit destroyed Houston's aft turret, killing dozens of sailors in an instant. The explosion twisted steel, flooded compartments, and permanently reduced her firepower. Many ships would have withdrawn after such damage. Houston did not. Temporary repairs were made in primitive conditions. Wounded men were treated. The dead were buried at sea, and ammunition was redistributed to keep the remaining guns firing. The crew understood that their ship was no longer at full strength, but they also understood that there was no one left to replace them. At the center of this resolve stood Captain Albert H. Rooks, calm, methodical, and deeply respected. Rooks had already led Houston through repeated air attacks and chaotic retreats. He knew the odds were against them, yet he refused to abandon his mission or his crew. His leadership kept morale intact at a time when defeat felt inevitable. Life aboard Houston in those final days was a mixture of exhaustion and quiet determination. Sailors slept where they could. Damage control teams remained on constant alert. Gunners rehearsed drills, knowing their ammunition supply was dangerously low. Every man understood that the next battle might be their last. And yet, there was no panic. Houston had become more than a warship. She was a symbol, a reminder that even in retreat, resistance mattered. When orders came to attempt escape through the Sunda Strait, the crew knew the risks. The ship was slower now. Her firepower reduced, her radar unreliable. But staying in port under enemy air superiority meant certain destruction. Moving meant hope. As Houston slipped into the darkness beside HMAS Perth, her decks were cleared for action. The remaining turrets were manned. Ammunition hoists rattled softly below. Captain Rooks took his position on the bridge, eyes fixed ahead. He did not know that within hours, he would be mortally wounded. He did not know that his ship would fight until her last shell was fired. But the men of Houston knew one thing for certain. If they were to be sunk, it would not be in retreat. It would be with guns blazing. For Australia, HMAS Perth was more than just another cruiser. She represented the nation's forward line of defense in a war that was suddenly moving uncomfortably close to home. Originally commissioned into the Royal Navy and later transferred to the Royal Australian Navy, Perth was a modified Leander-class light cruiser smaller than Houston, but fast, agile, and well-handled. Her 8 6-inch guns lacked the raw stopping power of a heavy cruiser's armament, but in skilled hands, they could still be deadly. By early 1942, those hands were weary. Perth had already seen constant action since the opening months of the Pacific War. She had escorted convoys, supported evacuations, and fought in the desperate attempts to slow Japan's advance through Southeast Asia. Each mission stretched her crew further, physically and mentally. Her captain, Hector Heckwaller, was widely respected throughout the fleet. A veteran officer with a reputation for discipline and decisiveness, Waller understood the reality of their situation better than most. He knew that allied naval power in the region was collapsing and that survival depended on sharp judgment rather than blind optimism. Life aboard Perth in those final days reflected that understanding. There was little talk of victory. Instead, there was focus. Lookouts were doubled, guns were kept ready. Damage control parties drilled repeatedly, knowing how quickly night battles could turn lethal. The crew had learned, sometimes painfully, that Japanese forces excelled in darkness. Still, morale held. The sailors of Perth trusted their ship and their captain. They had fought alongside American and Dutch vessels before. They had endured losses and confusion. And yet, they remained operational when so many others had been sunk or forced to withdraw. When Perth joined Houston for the attempted breakout from Java, the pairing made sense. Together, they combined heavy and light cruiser capabilities. Together, they offered mutual protection. Alone, each would have been far more vulnerable. But even together, they were outmatched. Waller was under no illusions. He knew that the Sunda Strait was a narrow, dangerous passage ideal for ambush, but the alternatives were worse. Japanese aircraft dominated the skies. Ports were no longer safe. Delay meant encirclement. So he gave the order to proceed. As Perth entered the strait, her crew stood ready at action stations, eyes straining into the darkness. The sea ahead looked empty, deceptively calm, almost peaceful. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that they might slip through unnoticed. That moment did not last. Within minutes, searchlights would pierce the night, and Perth would be fighting for her life in a battle she could not win, but would not flee. Shortly before midnight, USS Houston and HMAS Perth entered the waters of the Sunda Strait. The channel was narrow, hemmed in by the dark silhouettes of Java to the east and Sumatra to the west. In daylight, it was a vital maritime corridor. At night, it became something else entirely, a confined space where speed, maneuvering room, and surprise meant everything. The Allied cruisers moved cautiously, maintaining radio silence. Lookouts scanned the horizon, searching for the faintest sign of movement. Intelligence reports had suggested the strait was clear of major enemy forces. If they could pass through undetected, open water lay beyond. At first, the reports seemed correct. The sea ahead appeared empty. Then came the first warning. Dark shapes began to emerge on the horizon, low silhouettes, barely visible against the shoreline. At first, they were assumed to be small patrol craft or neutral shipping. But as the cruisers closed the distance, the truth became clear. These were Japanese transports, dozens of them packed with troops and equipment, moving steadily toward Java's coast. Even worse, they were not alone. Escorting the convoy were multiple Japanese destroyers and cruisers, their crews already at battle stations. They had not expected Allied warships to appear in the middle of an invasion landing, but they were ready to react. Within moments, searchlights snapped on. Brilliant white beams cut through the darkness, locking onto Perth and Houston like spotlights on a stage. The element of surprise vanished instantly. So did any realistic chance of escape. Captain Waller and Captain Rooks faced an impossible decision. Turning back would mean retracing their path, through waters now swarming with enemy ships. Pressing forward meant charging directly into the heart of the invasion force. Either choice carried lethal consequences. They chose to fight. Orders rang out across both ships. Guns trained toward the nearest targets. Engines pushed to maximum output. The cruisers attempted to maneuver through the convoy, firing as they went, hoping to break contact and slip through the chaos, but the strait had become a trap. Japanese destroyers began launching Type 93 Long Lance torpedoes, weapons with extraordinary range and destructive power. Invisible in the dark, they raced toward the Allied ships from multiple directions, turning the surrounding waters into a minefield of moving steel. Shells splashed into the sea around Perth. Tracer fire streaked overhead. Explosions erupted among the transports as Allied guns found their marks, briefly lighting the night with orange fireballs. For a moment, confusion reigned on both sides. Japanese torpedoes struck some of their own ships. Transports were hit. Smoke and fire filled the strait. But for Houston and Perth, the situation only grew worse. They were surrounded. Every course led toward another enemy vessel. Every maneuver reduced the space in which they could operate. Ammunition was being expended at a frightening rate. What had begun as a desperate escape attempt had become something far more grim. This was no longer about breaking through. It was about how long they could survive. Make sure you're subscribed. You don't want to miss what happens next. The full scale of the disaster became clear only minutes after the fighting began. What Houston and Perth had stumbled into was not a scattered patrol or a lightly guarded convoy. It was a major Japanese invasion force, one of the final blows against Allied resistance on Java, and it was protected accordingly. Around the two cruisers moved at least 20 Japanese vessels. There were heavy and light cruisers, their guns capable of matching or exceeding Allied firepower. There were multiple destroyers, fast and aggressive, optimized for night combat. And behind them all, dozens of transports continued their approach to the beaches, indifferent to the chaos erupting around them. The Japanese Navy had prepared for this kind of fight. Years before the war, Imperial Japanese naval doctrine had emphasized night engagements, long-range torpedo attacks, and coordinated destroyer assaults. Crews were trained to operate without radar, relying on optics, discipline, and rehearsed maneuvering. Against such a force, Houston and Perth were severely disadvantaged. They lacked reliable radar coverage. Their ammunition supplies were limited. Their crews were already exhausted from weeks of continuous action. And worst of all, they were confined to narrow waters where speed and evasive maneuvering offered little protection. Japanese destroyers moved aggressively, crossing the Allied cruisers' bows and sterns, launching torpedoes from multiple angles. These were not warning shots. Each torpedo carried a massive warhead capable of tearing a cruiser apart with a single hit. The water around Perth and Houston became deadly. Lookouts shouted warnings as torpedo wakes were spotted at the last possible moment. Helm orders came in rapid succession hard to port. Then starboard each maneuver risking collision or grounding in the shallow strait. Meanwhile, Japanese cruisers opened fire. Shells slammed into the water and steel alike. Explosions tore into superstructures. Shrapnel sighed across exposed decks. Fires broke out, spreading smoke that made target identification even more difficult. Despite the odds, the Allied ships fought back fiercely. Houston's remaining 8-inch guns thundered in the night, scoring hits on enemy vessels and transports. Perth's 6-inch batteries fired rapidly, engaging multiple targets in quick succession. At times, the chaos was so complete that Japanese ships struck each other with gunfire and torpedoes. But confusion favored the side with numbers. For every Japanese ship damaged, several more remained unscathed. For every torpedo avoided, another was already on its way. The sheer volume of fire began to tell. Ammunition counters dropped alarmingly fast. On Houston, gunners realized they could not sustain this rate of fire indefinitely. On Perth, damage reports flooded the bridge. Hits, flooding, wounded men. Communications became fragmented as cables were severed and compartments sealed. There was no reinforcements coming, no air cover, no escape route left open. The battle had become a test of endurance, how long two ships could continue fighting against a force designed to overwhelm them, and in that test, time was the enemy. By now, the Sunda Strait was no longer a stretch of open water. It was a battlefield. Gunfire flashed continuously, turning night into a stuttering sequence of light and shadow. Explosions echoed off the surrounding coastlines, making it impossible to tell where one detonation ended and the next began. Smoke hung low over the sea, thick with burning fuel and cordite. On HMAS Perth, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Shells slammed into her hull and superstructure, tearing through plating and igniting fires on multiple decks. The bridge shook with each near miss. Communications faltered as cables were severed and compartments flooded. Yet the guns kept firing. Captain Waller remained on the bridge, calm amid the chaos, issuing precise orders as the ship weaved through torpedo tracks and incoming fire. Damage control teams fought desperately to contain flooding, knowing that even a small loss of stability could prove fatal. Then the torpedoes began to hit. A violent explosion rocked Perth as a Japanese torpedo struck her port side. The blast threw men off their feet, extinguished lights, and opened the hull to the sea. Water poured in, the cruiser slowed, her maneuverability compromised. Still, she fought on. Nearby, USS Houston was engaged at near point-blank range. Her guns fired relentlessly, muzzle flashes illuminating sailors' faces in stark white light. Hits were scored against enemy ships at distances so close that targets filled the optics. Japanese transports burned, their cargoes exploding in towering columns of flame. But Houston was taking punishment. Shells punched through her hull, fires broke out amidships. Shrapnel cut down exposed crewmen. The ship's already damaged structure groaned under the strain. Then, on the bridge, disaster struck. Captain Albert Rooks was mortally wounded by shell fragments. Despite his injuries, he refused to be evacuated immediately, continuing to give orders until he could no longer stand. His officers carried on, determined that the ship would not falter. As the battle raged, confusion reached its peak. Japanese destroyers launched wave after wave of torpedoes, some of which struck their own transports. The strait became littered with burning wreckage, Japanese and Allied alike. Ships maneuvered blindly through smoke and debris, often firing at muzzle flashes rather than confirmed targets. Ammunition stocks dwindled. On Houston, the order came to conserve shells. Each remaining round had to count. Gunners waited for clear targets, firing only when a hit seemed certain. The thunderous broadsides of earlier moments gave way to deliberate, measured shots. On Perth, flooding worsened, steering became unreliable. Fires spread despite heroic efforts to contain them. Casualties mounted, yet no order to abandon ship was given. Both crews understood something that required no words. This battle was not going to be won, but it could still be fought with honor. As minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the tempo of the engagement shifted. Japanese fire grew more precise. Allied movement slowed. The sea itself seemed hostile, illuminated by burning oil and shattered hulls. By the early hours of March 1, 1942, both cruisers were fatally wounded. Their end was approaching. By the early hours of March 1, USS Houston was fighting on borrowed time. Her engines still turned, but only barely. Fires burned unchecked in several compartments. Smoke poured from her superstructure, marking her position clearly against the night sky. With Captain Rooks gravely wounded, and later dying of his injuries, command passed to his officers' men, who knew the situation was beyond recovery. And yet, Houston did not disengage. Her remaining guns continued to fire, each shell sent downrange with deliberate care. Ammunition was nearly exhausted now. Every shot had to matter. Gunners waited until enemy ships filled their sights, then fired, knowing there might not be another chance. Around her, Japanese ships closed in. Destroyers maneuvered into ideal firing positions, launching torpedoes from multiple angles. Cruisers maintained a steady barrage of gunfire, their shells tearing into Houston's hull and upper works. The cruiser shuddered with every impact, her structure weakening by the minute. Then came the final blows. A torpedo struck Houston amidships, ripping open her hull and flooding engine rooms. Power failed across large sections of the ship. Moments later, additional hits followed, shells and torpedoes combining to deliver a fatal sequence. The order to abandon ship was given. For many aboard Houston, there was little time to react. The ship began to list heavily. Flames spread rapidly. Men leapt into the water amid falling debris, oil, and burning wreckage. Some were injured. Others were already exhausted beyond measure. Still, discipline held. Sailors helped one another over the side. Wounded men were supported as best as possible. Life belts were shared. In the water, survivors clung together, watching as their ship, once the pride of the Asiatic fleet, settled deeper into the sea. Shortly before sinking, Houston fired her last shell. It was a final act of defiance, launched into the darkness toward an enemy that vastly outnumbered her. Then, slowly, the cruiser rolled and disappeared beneath the surface of the Java Sea. Silence followed. The battle moved on. Japanese ships turned their attention elsewhere. Burning debris drifted across the water, illuminating the faces of survivors struggling to stay afloat. Of Houston's crew of more than 1,000 men, hundreds were gone. Those who remained faced a new ordeal: hours in the water, followed by capture and years of brutal imprisonment. Many would not survive that chapter of the war. But in her final moments, USS Houston had done exactly what she had always done. She fought, against impossible odds, without retreat, until there was nothing left to give. When the gunfire finally faded from the Sunda Strait, the battle was over, but the suffering was not. In the water, survivors from USS Houston and HMAS Perth clung to wreckage, lifebelts, and each other. The sea was littered with oil, debris, and the bodies of the dead. Fires still burned on the surface, casting an eerie glow over men struggling to stay afloat after hours of combat. Rescue did not come quickly. Japanese ships moved among the survivors, searching for intelligence officers and potential threats. Some men were pulled from the water immediately. Others were left to drift until dawn. For the wounded, the wait was often fatal. Those who were recovered were not treated as victors treat the defeated. They were taken prisoner. For many Allied sailors, capture marked the beginning of a far longer and more punishing ordeal than the battle itself. After brief interrogations, survivors were transported to holding camps across Southeast Asia. Food was scarce, medical care almost non-existent. Beatings and forced labor were routine. Men who had fought side by side now struggled simply to survive. Former gunners, engineers, and signalmen were sent to work on airfields, docks, and railways. Some would later be transported thousands of kilometers away, forced into labor projects, such as the infamous Burma-Thailand Railway. Disease spread rapidly through the camps. Malaria, dysentery, and beriberi claimed lives just as surely as enemy shells had at sea. By war's end, many of the men who survived the sinking of Houston and Perth would not live to see liberation. And yet, even in captivity, the bonds forged during the battle endured. Survivors shared food, supported the weak, and preserved the memory of their fallen shipmates. Stories of the final stand were quietly passed from man to man, accounts of bravery, discipline, and refusal to surrender in the face of overwhelming force. Back home, however, their story faded. The early months of 1942 were filled with disasters for the Allies. Defeats piled upon defeats. Larger battles and later victories would come to dominate public memory. The loss of 2 cruisers in a remote strait, far from home waters, was overshadowed. For decades, the Battle of Sunda Strait remained largely forgotten. There were no grand monuments, no sweeping naval victories to celebrate. Only the names of ships etched into memorials, and families who never saw their sons return. Yet the significance of their sacrifice endures. The crews of Houston and Perth had fought when the war was at its darkest. They had stood their ground not because they believed they would win, but because someone had to resist. They were not forgotten by those who survived. And they should not be forgotten now. The Battle of Sunda Strait may not be as widely known as Midway or the Coral Sea, but its significance resonates even decades later. It was a battle defined not by victory, but by courage, by discipline, by the unwavering commitment of men facing certain death. USS Houston and HMAS Perth were 2 ships against 20. Yet they fought as if numbers did not matter. In doing so, they left a legacy that transcends statistics or naval records. Strategically, the battle underscored the fragility of early Allied positions in the Pacific. The rapid collapse of the Dutch East Indies demonstrated how coordination, intelligence, and preparedness were often the difference between survival and disaster. Japan's mastery of night attacks, torpedoes, and combined operations set a standard that Allied navies would take months to counter effectively. But beyond strategy, the story of these cruisers is human. It is about sailors who refused to give in, even when survival seemed impossible. It is about captains who led by example, maintaining calm, and giving orders until their last breath. It is about crews who, in the darkness, helped one another fight fires, patch holes, and survive the chaos around them. Their sacrifice also teaches a broader lesson. Heroism is not always measured in victory. Sometimes, it is measured in defiance against overwhelming odds, in the will to stand firm when every factor pushes toward retreat. The men of Houston and Perth exemplified that principle in the purest sense. And while the world may have forgotten their names for a time, history is not. Today, memorials, museum exhibits, and personal accounts ensure that their bravery is remembered. Their story is told not only in military history books, but in the hearts of those who study courage under fire. For modern viewers, there is another dimension. Understanding the sacrifices made by those who came before helps contextualize the freedoms and alliances we take for granted today. Every naval engagement, every hard-fought battle, echoes into the present, reminding us that even small forces, when led with courage and determination, can make a profound impact. The Sunda Strait was dark, chaotic, and deadly. But in that night, Houston and Perth illuminated what true valor looks like. They went down, yes, but they went down fighting. And that is why this battle still matters. What do you think about this story? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Support the channel by subscribing and sharing this story with your friends. It helps a lot.